Yeah, 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 I'm ready. 1.21.
Hey, how y'all doing? This is Mongo Slade, and today we're going to talk about the WWE Untold documentary, which talks about Goldberg's streak. And in addition to that, I'm also going to go through some shoot interviews to sort of expand on the heat between Goldberg and Nash and try to clear up whether Nash really was booking at the time Goldberg's streak ended. So let's go into the documentary first, which was really good. I'm slowly over the years becoming a Goldberg fan. So I like that he said that he sort of put his own spin on the squash match. I tend to say he kind of reinvented the squash match. You can go back in the 80s and you'll see squash matches, guys would get no offense in, but they were never as exciting as a Goldberg squash match because those things were like epic. I lived through it. It's not just some stuff I saw on the on the internet. I lived through those Goldberg 2-minute squashes. I mean, you start having the idea that, oh, Goldberg sucks, but that's like months later. Anyway, so Goldberg said he come from a family of football players that, he said his dad and his uncles and all them played football. And they showed some interesting clips of young Goldberg, basically talking about whether, how some football players, they can't walk straight or something like that, a little bit later in life because how banged up they get. But he truly believed that playing football, it would be worth it. Like that's his passion for football. And, I can always tell, like, sometimes wrestling fans get a little pissed because wrestling isn't the first love of some wrestlers. But when you see somebody does have a passion for something, like Goldberg had a passion for football, it kind of sucks that, and then he go into his injury, what ended his career. It kind of sucks that happened. So what happened is he's playing for the Falcons. I believe he said it was a preseason game or something. And he was injured by a Philadelphia Eagles player where he ripped his abdomen from his pelvis, which sounds like he was drawn and quartered, like in Braveheart. That sounds horrible. Like it can't possibly be as bad as it came across in my mind. But all I thought was William Wallace being on that slab with people cutting his stomach open. I was like, oh hell no. So he said he had no plan B. All he wanted to do was play football, and it was snatched away from him. But he used to work out at the gym with various wrestlers. He said Sting used to be there. I believe DDP used to also be there. But he said he met DDP in a gentleman's club. They didn't say what Goldberg was doing in the gentleman's club. He might have been a bouncer or something. But then he says that DDP is the one who came up with the idea of him being a wrestler. That DDP suggested it, and then DDP said, DDP was in the documentary. He said that he suggested it to Bischoff that they sign this guy. And then this was the line of the entire, one of the many good lines in the whole joint, where he said Goldberg said he called Bischoff, or Bischoff called him, and he said he don't want to be a $500 a night throwaway piece of shit. He wanted to make a difference, and I was like, ooh, I like that. And then DDP talked about, he had a full head of hair when they met, and then he shaved his head and he got the tattoo, and he was kind of concerned about the similarities with Steve Austin. But Goldberg was like, no, I'm going to be completely different. So Bischoff, who was not physically in the documentary, they kind of used some voiceovers. Some of this, the Bischoff stuff was actually old, from like the old WCW, I think the Rise and Fall of WCW documentary. They used some of that audio, but it was later. Here they just said basically that Bischoff had no vision for Goldberg. He really didn't know what he had, but you could saw that he had an innate charisma and a presence, and he had some intensity. So they sent him to the power plant where he was trained by Buddy Lee Parker and Jody Hamilton. And he talked about how Buddy Lee Parker really kind of ran the power plant as like a legitimate boot camp. And the interesting thing about this is I believe Batista was there at the same time Goldberg was there. There's an incredible story about Batista basically flunking out of the power plant and how he was legitimately pissed at Buddy Lee Parker and how he ran the facility. And that's kind of, I don't know if it was around the same time that that Goldberg was there. It probably would have been later. But they were in the power plant. I'm pretty sure they were in the power plant around the same time. So anyway, Buddy Lee Parker was not was a favorite of Goldberg because he ran a place like a boot camp, and Goldberg was used to sports, so he kind of came across like a coach to him, where Batista was coming from a bouncing background. He was a bodybuilder, so he probably didn't take to this style. That whole people barking at you kind of thing. Not everybody likes that. Not everybody comes. It didn't work for everybody. So Jody Hamilton is the one who suggested the spear, or rather, Goldberg showed Jody Hamilton the spear because it's basically just a football tackle. And he said, you should do that. And for some reason, that ended up not being the finish, despite the fact that it looked cool, like a guy was getting hit by a train. And that Sarge, actually, Buddy Lee Parker, is the one who came up with the jackhammer, and that he had the idea in his mind, but he couldn't. He didn't have anybody to use it for. So eventually, he told Bill to do it, and Bill did it, and Bill could do it to most people, so he went with it, the jackhammer as a finish. So they start going through Goldberg's debut. And basically Nash is introduced at this point, and he says, WCW was the #1 wrestling promotion in the world when Goldberg debuted. We'll get into that later because Scott Hall said something similar. Basically, they didn't have any plans for Goldberg, so they basically just told him to do little things like not talk to Mean Gene Okerlund, kicking out of veterans, establish finishes. And, so Bischoff had the idea to make the entrance, the knocking on the doors, the police escort, to make him seem like a bigger star, to make him feel bigger. And the idea of the streak came from Mike Tenay, who had, grown up with sports and had a sports background and knew Goldberg had a sports background. And he says that he had kind of saw these various streaks. And it was basically told through somebody else that Mike Tenay has all these various streaks in basketball, how people really get behind these sorts of things. Now, as an aside, Dave Meltzer, I saw this on Twitter, was kind of trying to take credit for the Goldberg streak, and that he claims that he and Mike Tenay came up with it. I don't know how true that is. I really wish Mike Tenay had talked about it himself, or maybe somebody would have asked Mike Tenay. I don't know. I'm pretty sure he's still alive, right? But I know Dave Meltzer claims that he had something to do with this. And then Nash talks about, how they started inflating the numbers, and Nash kind of came across kind of a douchebag here. Like, we know that they're inflating the numbers. We already know that. But he says that, it became less impressive because they started to inflate the numbers, and then he was beating the same guys multiple times. Then they show, the 74th match, 74-0, Goldberg versus Raven, which was a great match. It was a fantastic match. One of Raven's best WCW matches. Raven was so underrated in WCW. He didn't get a lot of credit. But that's when DDP said he started noticing that Goldberg was getting heat in the back. And, that different guys started kind of wanting to put the screws to Goldberg. And Ash talked about Goldberg not really separating the character from the person, that he and Hall just was having fun with him. We'll get into this stuff later. But matter of fact, just talk about it now. So Scott Hall claims that he actually met Bill Goldberg before he was a star. That he saw Bill Goldberg. This is from various shoot interviews. That Scott Hall said when Goldberg was first getting started, he rode with him and slept in a hotel with him and all this sort of stuff. This is before Goldberg became Goldberg. And then once he became Goldberg, like the superstar, he became a mark for himself. And he started taking himself too seriously. And he started, started kind of getting the big head. And Hall decided, just because he's that kind of guy, he just started putting the screws to him. Like, kind of messing with him, psychologically. Not trying to hurt his push or anything, hurt his business or anything like that. But basically just fucking with him, and stuff like that. We'll get into a little bit more of that later. But Nash said that Goldberg was just, was too sensitive. So when it got to 100-0, it was Conan. I wish they would have had Conan on here. So Hogan said Hogan took credit for the Georgia Dome match with Goldberg on Nitro, saying it was his idea. That because Goldberg played football for the Falcons, that, it would make sense for Goldberg to be in the Georgia Dome for that match to take place. Goldberg, once again, he said it in various documentaries that he found out actually while watching Thunder on TV, that he was going to be wrestling Goldberg at the Georgia Dome. So he said the building meant a lot to him. The Georgia Dome, because the last time he had been there before he wrestled Hogan was when he played as a member of the Atlanta Falcons. So he hadn't been in the building since 1994. So this was like 4 years later. So it meant a lot to him. And he said that, earlier in the night he had to wrestle Scott Hall. and that Scott Hall was messing with him in the match, talking about that Goldberg was trying to ruin the match and all that type of stuff. But Goldberg said that he was kind of intimidated. It was 40,000 people or something like that in the building, and they were all watching him, all there to see him not screw up. And he was like, he was having troubles, and he ended up having to power through that. The crowd and the magnitude of it was just so much for him. But he didn't go into the Hogan match, with the best mental frame because, he felt like Hall was sort of, messing with him earlier in the night. So he said he looked up to Hulk Hogan, that he wanted to be as successful as Hulk Hogan was one day. And then he says that Hogan kind of tried to sabotage the match, that Hogan put icy hot under his armpit and then put Goldberg's head under his armpit. So the icy hot got into Goldberg's eyes. And he said that he couldn't really see for a while. And that's kind of when Hogan started taking control. Now, Hogan is a dirty motherfucker. He just is. Now, whether he would try to intentionally blind, now Goldberg believes that Hogan did this on purpose. He does have a bit of a persecution complex, this Bill Goldberg, because remember, they kind of skipped over the whole thing with William Regal, where he talked about William Regal taking liberties. But in the documentary, they did show William Regal would throw two pretty hard kicks. Both of them were to the face, by the way. They didn't mention those. I would have really liked to see if Goldberg and Regal talk about it on the documentary. But they show when he wrestled William Regal that William Regal did kick him in the head once, and then he kicked him in the face once. When Regal was on his back, he kicked upwards and hit Goldberg right in the face. But Goldberg has said a lot that William Regal put the screws to him, tried to make him look bad, that Hall and Nash were trying to make him look bad, and that Hogan, here he just says Hogan tried to blind him, by putting icy hot on his eyes. He said he believes that Hogan did it on purpose, but Hogan always claims that it didn't happen on purpose. I've never actually heard that story before. That's freshly new to me, that Hogan had like some type of cream on him that got into Goldberg's eyes. So he says that winning the title, while it was important to him, it was not as big of a deal as what took place afterwards. So he says that after the cameras went off the air, the NWO beat him up, and then he was saved by the Atlanta Falcons. His former teammates had come out to help him. And he said like that meant a lot to him because he wanted to be like them and was never allowed to play again because of his injury. And now the role had been reversed. And now just for a few minutes, they wanted to be like him. They wanted to be on his side. They wanted to be, Bill Goldberg, the pro wrestler. So it was a nice little role reversal. And he was actually kind of emotional about that. And I thought that was pretty cool. Like, it is kind of interesting that, this guy who, he played football, but he wasn't, a big star or anything. And, he gets the opportunity to be bigger than any individual Atlanta Falcon ever. Because this guy, they talk about it later, like he was a huge draw. He was on the cover of magazines and TV Guide and different things like that. And, he became like this big star, So in a way, he became bigger than the Atlanta Falcons. Not the entire team, obviously, but any individual player on the team, none of them reached the heights of success that Bill Goldberg did, which is really impressive. So Goldberg then says that, he took himself very seriously, and he said he admitted that he did because, he says, my character is me. So of course I take myself seriously. I apologize if you're not as passionate about your job. That's, of course, a thinly veiled shot at Hall and Nash, who we'll talk about it. Matter of fact, let's talk about it right now. Scott Hall and Kevin Nash basically just called Goldberg a mark. Say, he's a mark for himself. He didn't ever want to lose. He didn't ever want to do anything. He couldn't talk. We drew the buildings, and he became a big star because of us. They didn't say it in those terms, but Scott Hall basically said, Goldberg debuted in front of a sold-out building. So when people say, he was such a big star, it's like, well, we were stars before that. That's kind of what he was saying. Like, we drew the building. We built this guy. Like, how dare he have such a big ego when we built him? And that makes sense. And plus, Scott Hall says that he took care of Goldberg early. Now, I don't know what the relationship is between Scott Hall and Bill Goldberg. I don't think anybody has ever sat down and gone through that. But it was really interesting that the attitude of Hall and Nash in the various shoot interviews when they talk about Goldberg, about how they just basically didn't like him, and basically they just admitted to being assholes. Like, it was kind of weird that these two guys basically just admitted that they didn't really care, that they were just showing up, and in some ways they were burnt out and just, going along for the ride. And they basically were saying like, oh yeah, we were just having fun. We were just messing around with him. It wasn't personal. We liked him as a person, but we just decided to, mess with him a little bit because he took himself so seriously. He was so wound up. And it was kind of screwed up, and at the same time. So let's get back to the documentary. So DDP talked about, being in the main event of Halloween Havoc 1998. And that is one of his top 3 favorite matches. And then Goldberg talked about how great DDP is. And that, how DDP goes, has meticulous detail over every spot within a match. We know this because DDP scripts matches, which is something he learned from Randy Savage. And he talked about how great the match was. And then DDP went through the match of how Goldberg was so intense, how he never, he never slowed down. So he ran himself into the ring post and messed up his shoulder for a shoot. So what looked like, that this is, now we know that Goldberg does this. He runs his head against stuff. He did that multiple times. He did it in WWE. He banged his head up against that door. He put his hand through that window later in WCW. Like, he gets so amped up that he thinks he's invincible, and then he ends up hurting himself. He hurt himself twice in this one match. He ran his shoulder into the ring post because DDP moved, and DDP was supposed to move, but Goldberg wasn't supposed to be going so fast that he couldn't control himself. And then he also knocked himself out by hitting DDP with a spear. He said he hit him with the spear, and he hit him with such force that he drove his own head into the mat and knocked himself unconscious in the middle of the match. And he said, and this is where, DDP puts him in the diamond cutter, and he talked about how the reaction of when DDP hit the diamond cutter on Goldberg and how big it was. And yes, it is amazing. Like, that single moment alone, when you hear the crowd like erupt at the diamond cutter, tells you how over DDP was, how over the diamond cutter was, and how over Goldberg was. Like, it was amazing. Because sometimes people didn't even get their finish in on Goldberg, so that was a big deal. And basically, Goldberg says he kind of started waking up as he was doing the jackhammer to DDP. And this is, I know some people are like, well, how could that be? It's like, well, sometimes your body continues to function even though you're knocked out. You kind of have that muscle memory. Guys talk about that a lot, like they were unconscious. They don't remember much of the match, and it's crazy. But Goldberg said it was the best match he ever had, and DDP says that the reason why people got so behind Goldberg is because his stuff was believable. He was Bill Goldberg. That was his name. That's who he was. His character was himself. Size, strength, intense, all that sort of stuff. Everything you saw on TV was real, and that's why it was so believable. That's why people got so behind it, and I believe that too. So then Goldberg said that the 2-minute squash match actually hit its peak, that people were kind of wanted more. Now this is where Hall, Nash, Bischoff, and everybody else that I've listened to start to jump on Goldberg. They start to say that, okay, well, now at this point there were a lot of negative anti-Goldberg fans that, they would go into towns and they would chant Goldberg sucks. That, now it was never mentioned in the documentary, but, it was enough people, and Bischoff admitted it. So I'm pretty sure it's true, that were anti-Goldberg, that he had beaten people so much and beaten people so fast that it was becoming stale. And even Goldberg himself said, well, people it was time for something else. People had to do something else, but he didn't know. And Nash said that it was story time. We had to find a way to get some sympathy on this guy. That there needed to be some vulnerability to him. People were getting bored of him. They were getting sick of him. Something needed to happen. So Goldberg says like he hadn't been in the business long enough to really understand it. That you have to give people things and then take it away. And fans don't understand that. They still don't understand that today. That stories are give and take. Sometimes you have to kill your darlings in order to progress the story. Sometimes you have to do other things that people might not like in order to progress the story. And Goldberg says like he wasn't in the business long enough to understand that. So there was decisions that were made that he didn't really understand, that he didn't really get. He said that he was the top guy in the business, but he never gave any advice. And he never had any ideas. He just did whatever they told him to do. And he says that he was booked to lose at Starrcade, and that's what he did. He said he didn't ask any questions. So Nash talks about the big fight feel of the Starrcade '98 match. That Nash is he's a big guy. Goldberg is a big guy. It's two big guys having a match, and then Kevin Nash tells this great story about Goldberg kind of overwhelming him, and he put Goldberg in an arm bar, and he said like the crowd was waking up like, whoo, Nash is doing wrestling holds. And he said then Goldberg killed it by getting out of the arm bar too quickly and snatching his arm away. He was like, you're killing me. That's such a douche. All right, so they talk about the finish. Now, the finish has been one of the more controversial things in the wrestling business, is whether the cattle prod and all the run-ins and all that type of stuff. Now, Nash thought the finish was great, and he maintained that over time, that he thought that the finish was fine, because they protected him with all the run-ins, Disco Inferno run-in and the Bam Bam Bigelow run-in, and that, these guys were, trying to protect Goldberg. So Goldberg says that, that the cattle prod was not the first idea, that the first idea was a police taser. They were actually going to use a physical police taser that shoots out wires and has prods in it. That's how they work in the United States. I don't know if they work anywhere else the same way, where a taser is like, you shoot out these wires and they have prods on the end, and you pull the trigger and they electrify whatever. And Goldberg said that's what he wanted. He wanted them to literally tase him with a literal taser. And that just goes to show like how crazy Goldberg is. Like, he's an insane person. Why would you ever want to be tased? And DDP said like that's out of the question. Like, we can't do that. So they came up with the cattle prod as the second option, and then it was also much safer because you could do. They did the whole taping it thing, so he wouldn't really get electrocuted. So so 73-1, and Nash is the one. So it became a big deal near the end because Goldberg says, well, they beat me on my birthday, December 27th, 1998. And he says he told Nash that. And he said, Nash then said he responded that December 27th, 1994 is the day his mom died. So he said, I think I got you beat. And I was like, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. This is like, oh man, these guys they too old to act like this. Anyway, but it was great. It's great stuff. So then it became a situation where Goldberg believes that Nash booked himself to win the match. And then Nash says that he wasn't on the booking committee. Nash has said this 100 times that he was not on the booking committee when Goldberg during the Goldberg match. There's an RF video shoot where Nash says he got on the booking committee in February of 1999. This match took place in December of 1997. Now, let's talk about this for a moment. Just because you were officially hired as the booker in 1999 doesn't mean you didn't have any booking authority in 1998. Okay, now, because we know that Bischoff and Hogan and all this type of stuff, they have been talking about this stuff for a while. There's also shoot interviews where Nash talked about the finger poke of doom. And basically, Nash said, I wouldn't have booked myself into this situation where I would have dropped the title to Hogan. And it didn't make me look good. So why would I book it that way? I didn't have the power to book myself. And then I wouldn't have done it in a way to put Hogan over with the finger poke of doom. I wouldn't have done that. And basically, Goldberg he did it. So Goldberg says that Nash was booking. Nash says that he wasn't. Bischoff also says that he wasn't. But there is people who think that Nash was booking at the time. So who are these people? Well, these people are Disco Inferno and Konnan. Now, why would I care about Disco Inferno and Konnan? Here's the thing. Disco Inferno was riding with Hall and Nash at the time. So this is Disco Inferno and Konnan, where they talked about Nash being on the booking committee, that basically he had power. He said that, Goldberg had pretty much bitched about doing the job, and that, he had been asked if he was okay with it. And he said, yeah, but secretly he still had a problem with it. And then, said Conan said basically that Hall and Nash were out to get Goldberg for a long time, and basically they got him. Then Disco talks about Goldberg, the crowd turning on him, and then that was kind of the reason why Hall and Nash was able to get in this situation and get the belt off of him, is because the crowd had begun to turn on him, and that was very interesting, you know. And so Eric Bischoff, in a different interview, I believe it was on his podcast. It's from the 83 Weeks podcast on from Starrcade 98. He talks about the plan to beat Goldberg began in August or September of 1998. So it basically began 2 months before it happened. So about 3 months before it actually happened, 3 or 4 months before it actually happened, they had already planned to beat Goldberg. And he said basically they were running out of ideas. He didn't really like to finish, but they were running out of ideas, and Goldberg had to lose. So basically, they gave themselves all this time to come up with an idea of how to beat Goldberg. And Bischoff, much like Nash, said that they needed to create some type of vulnerability. They needed to create a humanity within Goldberg. They needed to be able to tell stories with him. And they felt like you could not tell a story with him the way that he was, undefeated, unbeaten, just a train running people over. And he says that Nash was picked because Nash was believable. He was also a big guy, and people could believe that with a little bit of help, he could beat Goldberg. So then he said that, the idea, and Nash has said the same thing, even though Nash kind of deviates a little bit with his timeline. But Bischoff, Hall, Nash, all of these guys basically said that there was going to be a stable of heels that were going to conspire against Goldberg, get the belt off of him, and then Goldberg would have to tell the story of his comeback, that he would have to run through all these guys in order to get his belt back. Then Nash claims that Goldberg put his hand through the wall, put his fist through a glass, through some glass or something like that, and screwed it up. But that was actually later. But then also Bischoff did the finger poke of doom and put the belt back on Hogan. He said he probably wouldn't have changed. He probably would have changed that, but he felt like Goldberg absolutely could not lose clean, and that it had to be. But he felt like the cattle prod was anticlimactic, and I tend to agree. Now my whole conception of Goldberg losing his streak is it did need to happen. He did need to lose, and he could not lose clean. But I don't know. I don't know if Nash was the right guy. And I think that the conflict of interest with Nash being, even if he wasn't officially, quote unquote, on the booking committee, he had some kind of stroke. He had enough stroke that when a booking committee spot opened, he got it. So, and plus Hogan was there, and maybe it was some elaborate plan to get Hogan get the belt back on Hogan. But it was really weird. It was it was time, and Bill Goldberg himself has said that he don't know if it was time or not. He didn't feel like that was a decision he needed to make. He just felt like it was weird how it took place, and he just felt like it was done improperly, or it was whether it was done because personal beef with Hall and Nash, or was it done because of business. Hall, Nash, Bischoff all say it was completely business, that the crowd was turning on Goldberg, so they pulled the trigger on taking the belt off of him. It was only just a matter of who was going to do it and how they were going to do it. And then they came up with apparently Goldberg says they had the taser idea. Then the cattle prod came. They did all the run-in stuff. They felt justified in doing so because the crowd erupted when Goldberg lost. Now, on 83 Weeks, Conrad basically talked about how there was inside the building, there were some noticeable anti-Goldberg sentiments. Basically, some Goldberg sucks. I guess this is coming from the dirt sheets and people who may be reporting to the dirt sheets that there were chants of Goldberg sucks. But when Goldberg actually appeared, there was more pro Goldberg, people who were drowning them out. Kind of sounds familiar, much like John Cena and Roman Reigns and all these guys. And Bischoff has compared Goldberg to them. But they said that basically they felt justified of taking the belt off Goldberg when they did, by the reaction to when Goldberg lost, which was a huge reaction. There's numerous ways to look at when things get a huge reaction. Goldberg losing is one thing. I don't think they would have expected stunned silence. Much like when the streak was broken. I don't think nobody saw that coming. But when Goldberg's streak was broken, I think that there probably was a pocket of people who was ready for that. There's always going to be a pocket of people who are ready for that. And a lot of this comes from Hall and Nash talking about how over they were in the area. So let's talk about that for a moment. So Starrcade 1998 took place in Washington, D.C., which is technically the Northeast. Now, this is very important because Hall and Nash are WWF guys, or perceived to be Razor Ramon and Diesel. The original territory of the WWF was Washington, D.C. to New York City. So they felt like that was their home turf, and that him wrestling Nash in Washington, D.C. in the Northeast was putting the screws to Goldberg already, and that there was going to be more people anti-Goldberg in that building than pro-Goldberg. And I say, if that's the case, why would you book him to wrestle Nash in the Northeast? Why would you do that? That wouldn't make any sense. If you guys were that over in the Northeast, and they talked about how they did house shows, and I think Hall said Uniondale, New York. They would go to New York and Goldberg would get booed out of the building because he was almost always working with, he would just get booed because that was a Steve Austin WWF crowd, and they didn't like WCW and they didn't like Goldberg in particular, but they did like Hall and Nash because they were perceived as WWF guys. So I think that that's just, I guess you have to be over everywhere if you're the top guy. You have to get over everywhere. But I think that if you're going to say, well, we took the belt off of him because people were chanting Goldberg sucks, it's like if you were running towns where he's not over, or if you're running towns where there's going to be guys who are more over due to regional bias, yeah, I would think so. It's like, if you were to run, like running against Ric Flair and Charlotte, if you're going to run against Ric Flair and Charlotte, of course people are going to say Goldberg sucks. Charlotte is Flair country. It's like, is that really fair? I don't know. But I tend to agree that if you're going to be the top guy, you have to be over everywhere, at least for the most part. And it was still maybe the right thing to do to drop the belt to a guy who's over in that area, much like when John Cena dropped the belt to Rob Van Dam in Philadelphia or CM Punk in Chicago, to have Goldberg drop the belt to Nash, a quote unquote WWF guy in the Northeast. It makes sense. And, at least, it makes sense to me sitting here in 2020. It makes sense. So the documentary actually ended with Goldberg talking about how the streak made him larger than life. It made him basically a superhero, and it really felt good for him to be a superhero to kids. And he said that's really the one thing that wrestling has given him, is that it's given him the ability to be a larger than life figure for young people who need larger than life figures. And he takes that very seriously. And he's said that numerous times. Remember when he first came back, or his second run in the WWE, he talked about how that was for his son. How his son had never seen him wrestle before. And, when he won the Universal title and all that type of stuff, even though people bitched about it online, that it meant something because it was for his son. It meant something because he was still a larger than life figure for children. And that he felt like that's important for, that kids need a Goldberg character. And I'm somebody who, for the record, I am a person who is a full believer that children do need heroes. They do need clean-cut heroes, and Goldberg sometimes fits the bill, not to be, it's just kind of how it is, in a world where, especially when you're taking all the kids' heroes away from them very often, it does add something for you to have somebody who is larger than life, who is a star, who is not just is a top guy draw for normies and stuff like that, but for somebody who kids can buy into as being a superhero, that means something. Now, if you could have said that Goldberg stands for something, you could have put some of that stuff out there, that, Goldberg stands for truth, justice, in the American way, much like Hulk Hogan or something like that. That probably would have been a little bit better. But a lot of people just looked at Goldberg like a battering ram, like you just basically ran people over and that's it. But I do support the larger than life Bill Goldberg conception, and that he is a heroic figure for a lot of people, especially at the time. I was too old to have Goldberg as a hero. I was 14. There was no way I was interested in Bill Goldberg. I was more interested in Raven. But that's just being a teenager. You know, you're rebellious against the things that people are trying to, you know, shove on you. I didn't even like Steve Austin, if we're being honest. But I was more of a Mick Foley guy. But you have this conception of Goldberg and the impact that he's had on young people in the industry, he's had, you know, on the business. And DDP, being the guy who introduced him to the business, you know, pretty much ends the documentary by saying that, you know, he's very proud of, you know, how Goldberg made such a huge impact. And that, you know, it's kind of strange to him that he is a guy who, when they met him in a gentleman's club, in a strip club, that, you know, he suggested that the guy go wrestle. He had no idea he would be the biggest star WCW ever produced outside of like Sting. So it's amazing. That's a hell of a story, man. I love this documentary. It was really fun. I like doing a lot of the extra stuff that goes with it because the heat with Hall, Nash, and Goldberg is tremendous stuff. Now I can't trust anything Hogan says because Hogan is full of shit. I'm actually, because Hall and Nash own being assholes, I tend to believe things that they say. Because they don't really hide that they fucked with Goldberg or they fucked with anybody. Disco Inferno also just basically said, I used to ride with Hall and Nash all the time. They used to talk about how, you know, people are chanting Goldberg sucks and people were not liking Goldberg anymore. Now, I think that to add to this, I think that it's weird that we listening to like a small pocket of people that, you know, taking the belt off Goldberg while it was the right thing to do. I just think that you should have kind of waited a little bit and maybe let him hold it maybe a couple of weeks longer while you build another person for him to lose to. I fully understand you concept of you want him to lose on the big stage, but I'm just not sure if that was the way to do it. I'm just not sure. The cattle prod for me was fine. I liked the cattle prod idea. I just, you know, and for it to be Hall and Nash, the way Nash told the story that it was going to be babyface versus babyface because he was a babyface at the time, and that Hall would cheat without Nash knowing that Hall cheated, and that would cause a rift between Hall and Nash. But then they would make up, and then it would be them and Hogan against Goldberg. So Goldberg would have to fight the NWO essentially. That was fine, but I think the NWO had pretty much run. The NWO had peaked the year before. So to me, like that didn't work. I think that Goldberg should have been used to push WCW forward. So there had to have been somebody on the roster that Goldberg hadn't beat that could have beaten them, even if it was in the same way with the cattle prod or something like that. And that would have been fine. Now, this is on the subject of the cattle prod. This wasn't the first time WCW had used a cattle prod finish. They had also used one in the Cactus Jack Vader match, where Cactus Jack had gotten tased or prodded by Harley Race in order to lose the match. It didn't make sense then because that match was a last man standing match. It made a lot more sense in the Goldberg match. But, you know, I'm okay with it. It's very unique. I don't think anybody's tried to use a cattle prod or a taser or anything like that since. At least not that I can remember off the top of my head. But so it's always going to be memorable because of that. And the Goldberg streak was a big deal, especially when I was a kid. It was a big deal. I did, you know, watch some of the bigger matches that Goldberg was in. Like if he was wrestling somebody I figured, oh, this guy got a chance, then I watched that. Like the last one I watched live was probably Raven because I was a big fan of Raven. But after that, I would just kind of be like, oh, well, Goldberg wrestled who? Oh, okay. Maybe I'll watch that some other time. You know, if it's taped somewhere, I'll watch it. But that was it. Thank you guys for listening. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to this channel. If you like alternative wrestling media, then hit me on the Cash App and take the $1 challenge. I appreciate you guys, and I'll talk to you guys later.